So I made a video about the Zanj culture and how it differs dramatically from the Arabic culture. Now, the reason why I did this was because there's a clear difference between the Zanj and the Arabs. Even today, the Zanj people, even though they were considered Muslim, they were definitely not considered Arabs in any way, shape, or form. So that question was gone. And so the question became, how do you make the difference between Arab and Persian culture? And to answer this, it's actually a long or short answer. The simple one was by simply looking at the culture. And then, of course, he commented back, a lot of what people think as Arab culture is actually Persian or Turkic culture. Now, good point, except that a lot of what we call Arab culture is not Arab culture at all. It's all cultures that were in those regions. For example, Persian, Egyptian, Turkic, East African, Zanj, Berber culture, all of those cultures get blended and get mistaken because the people look Middle Eastern as Arab culture. But what's Arab culture? Remember, the culture of the Arabs has changed dramatically over the years. We had the Golden Age of Islam, that's one of the cultures of the Arabs, and then we have the disappearance of that, which, it's not the sharpest decline. I mean, it was around in the 1800s. We still have find great scientists doing work at that time. People make it sound like it just fell. So, what are we talking about? Well, if we look back in time instead of looking at our time now, so in other words, if we look at images and things back in time, we could tell that Arabs are very different from what we think. So if you look over here, what I have is the table of races. And this table of races is, you really start from like Assyria going east or the Assyrians going west, and you'll start to see the locations that are located on here. So the ones at the top represent the eastern countries. You can see the Hindu, Persian, Median, Elamite, Parthian, Aryan, Bactrian, Sogdian. Almost all of these at the top will never be considered part of the Arabs necessarily, and I will show you why. And then the ones at the bottom here, the Saka, the Babylonian, Assyrian, Arab, Egyptian, Armenian, Cappadonian, Lydian, Ionians, overseas Saka, Skurdian, Ionians, Libyans, and Ethiopians. Parts of these people will become Arabs. But as you can see in this image, only one of them is considered Arab. And you can ask yourself, why? Why is this person considered an Arab? Well, let's show a map that depicts the people from back in the day, the Arabs from back in the day. As you can see here, this is the Persian Empire, and you can see that Arabs are only in this very small location, the Arabic Peninsula. And obviously, it includes Oman, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and a bit of Jordan. But the rest of the areas would be non Arab areas back in the day. Now, the Arab influence would spread dramatically in the future, but during this time, the Arabs were being called Arabs because they were considered to be nomadic, they were considered to be very, very different, and their rock art depicts things from the past which show that they had a completely different culture than anywhere else, and you know they had some amazing cities in those areas from way back. I'm talking 8000 BC, but you will see only later that a lot of these will be acknowledged because they didn't invent any writing. One of the interesting civilizations located in Saudi Arabia is Dumat al-Jandil, but that is a story for another day. But from phys.org, let's read, in contrast to the prehistoric remains of the Near East, the megalithic monuments of Arabia remain largely unknown. These monumental structures, made of dry stone walls, still hold many secrets in terms of their construction, function, and chronology. An international collaboration of scientists from France, Saudi Arabia, and Italy, led by Oliver Munoz, a researcher at the CNRS, have discovered a 35-meter long triangular platform in the oasis of Dumat al Jandal, northern Saudi Arabia, built in several phases from the 6th millennium BC. This exceptional monument was probably dedicated to ritual practices, some of which were probably funerary and commemorative. To arrive at these conclusions, scientists studied and dated the object and human remains from deposit found in and around the platform, in the two side niches, and also in nearby tombs. These discoveries, which appear in the journal Antiquity on June 9th, 2020, demonstrate a ritual use during prehistoric and are a potentially symbolic imprint left by nomadic pastoralists in the landscape during this remote period. Now, obviously, the nomadic part they took from the fact that the Arabians of Arabia were nomadic people, and so it's possible that this very early site, which we find rock burials and rock buildings there, drywall, so walls stacked on top of each other, is a result of these people either settling for a small amount of time, or the fact that we just don't know how humans create buildings. And if we look anywhere, even in Africa, we're going to start to find buildings in areas we didn't expect. But this is just to give you a background on Arabia. So this is Arabia, Saudi Arabia, Oman, those places. Now, if you wanted to separate the cultures of these people and anywhere else, all you'd have to look at is the Fertile Crescent, which is probably where most people would say the sort of Sumerian influence starts. So civilizations that are kind of Sumerian in their likeness. So the Assyrians, the Akkadians, those people, Elam, all of these Medians, all these people, Persians, and then you go all the way, and those are influence until you, of course, you get to the Indian areas. If the Arabs were to be separated back then, you would easily be able to do it. And of course, Africa has had its influence on Saudi Arabia since back in the day, probably going back 6,000 BC, 4,000 BC, who knows. The reason why this influence is there is because, of course, we find the camel located in Saudi Arabia, and we find it located in East Africa at the same time. And then we find it located in other parts of Africa, but we know it probably didn't go through the Sinai region, probably came through East Africa, because Egypt doesn't have camels until very late. So how is it that all these regions located here in green would be considered Arab regions when only this little place was the Arab regions? Well, it has to do with a very popular Muslim who is not pictured here. I wouldn't picture him because it's against the religion, but it was Muhammad. This is just an Islamic scholar. Muhammad, because of you know, his influence, and he was from Saudi Arabia, grew the religion from that one area, and very fast, almost 200 years, you had people as far as Spain calling themselves Arabs. It didn't matter what race they are, it didn't matter what, people everywhere were calling themselves Arabs. Now, people still had regional names. Some Persians were Arabs. I mean, I know we want to pretend that all Persians in the Islamic Golden Age, they were like, no, we're Persians and Persians are different. But it's not true. A lot of Persians settled in very Arabic areas and they considered themselves Arabs. And even the change that would happen where, you know, certain words and stuff would be taken away, that had nothing to do with that. Now, if we look at this map, we can tell here that Yemen and Saudi Arabia once belonged to the Kingdom of Aksum. This is prior to the invasion of the Muslims. And so there were black people who existed in Saudi Arabia and Yemen who are even mentioned in the Quran. And I've made a long video about Africans who played huge roles in Islam. In fact, they almost take the first few big roles, being companions of Muhammad and dying for his cause and being considered some of the, people who are going straight to heaven in the religion. And then, of course, the Ethiopian king who was said in the early books of Islam that he went to crush the rock of the Kaaba. These people would also be considered Arabs later, but at the time they were considered Ethiopians and nothing more, even though they were located in the Arabian areas. With the growing and the expanding of these, clearly the Arab identity was linked to Islam, clearly, and some places would 100% consider themselves Arab because of Islam. So, of the old locations, probably Jordan, Iraq, and Syria would be newcomers in the Middle East of what an Arab is. And then, of course, all these other areas that don't necessarily consider themselves Arab, you know, that's fine. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that solves it. That's easy. If you look at these areas, these are the areas that were first influenced by Arabians, and therefore this is Arab culture. Well, let's look at a different map. The East and West divide return again. So if we look at this map, we can see here that all the places that we mentioned as Arabia are located to the west, of course, with the exception of some of the European areas or the European areas. Everybody else is considered Arab. And of course, when you get into deep Africa, they stop being considered Arab. But if you go on the other side of Iran, because people like to mention Iran as if it's the only exception, right? Like Persians are not Arabs. Well, I'll show you who else isn't Arabs. You know that Afghanistani people or Afghans are not Arabs? Do you know that Pakistani people are not Arabs? You know that Turkmen are not Arabs? Uzbek, Kazakhstani people are not Arabs, even though they all represent that sort of unified culture. And so it's not a matter of Iran, it's a matter of location to some degree. It's not a matter that they're Persian. And I can promise you there were a lot of these people who contributed to those cultures. So this is a map depicting, the Islamic conquest and the places that started playing a role in the golden age of Islam. And remember that in the golden age of Islam, India would play a role, Persia played a role, Afghanistan would play a role, all the way to China. People don't know this, but there's like Muslims in China, there were Muslims in Korea, and just like before, like I showed you with the Xerxes table of races, the people sort of located in the West have a different name, Arabs, and the people on the other side, they have multiple different names. But in our modern world, we really need to call them various names. So, for example, Iranians would be Iranians, or Persians, if you like, but Persia doesn't exist, so it's kind of weird to call them Persians. Um, if you go to Pakistan, you call them Pakistani. If you go to, you know, Kazakh, they're Kazakh people, or if you'd like, you know, like Mongols or anything like that. I mean, or Turks, another word for them. And yes, it's confusing because of course everyone thinks that Turks are like, from Europe, but you know, there's a long history of Turks both in Europe and in the areas of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and Russia, but that's a story for another day. If we keep going further and further, we get into these. So the one unifier of all these places that they're Muslim. But then let's start to separate. Let's break down the culture of the Arabs. Well, what is Arab culture? If you'll notice, when you say Arab culture, for the most part, you mean Muslim culture, mosques, all of that. Even the stories of 1,001 Arabian Nights, a lot of it is less to do with a specific Arab culture. I'll give you an example. Aladdin's uncle in 1001 Arabian Nights is a Berber from North Africa, I think Morocco. And then, of course, you have Aladdin, who's from somewhere else. And then you have the Persian who, wanted to marry. And then you have it's this huge expanded piece of land that is being talked about in 1001 Arabian Nights. Now, of course, let's go back to the original question. What's the difference between Arab culture and Persian culture? Well, this question is quite different than the one that I was doing about Zanj culture and Arab culture, because the Zanj were Swahilian people, meaning that their culture was vastly different in the same way that the Berbers' culture is vastly different than the Arabs located in those areas. So, if you want to know who the Arabs are, the true Arabs, if you want to know who they really are, the strict Arabs, and you know their culture and blah blah. A lot of people like to say this thing. I've heard this a lot. Don't you know that Persians are different than Arabs? Well, yeah, but so many other people. Everyone who's not an Arab is different than Arabs. So, who am I? Who's everyone? Well, I'm telling you, Berbers of North Africa are not Arabs. Egyptians who are native to Egypt are not Arabs. The people of Persia are not Arabs. Afghans are not Arabs. Uh, Pakistani people are not Arabs. The only people who are Arabs and the people who expanded from the that area and now claim these other areas which they expanded into are the people from Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, those areas. Now, mixed into there is a whole bunch of people from all over the Middle East who couldn't remember exactly where their people came from, but that's where the Arab culture comes from. The question of culture is impossible to answer to some degree because that's why I'm not even delving into like what's the difference. Do Arabians make coffee this way or that way? Because that's not a thing. Culture is an ever moving thing. By the way, I'd like to introduce one more concept to you that is just about culture in general. So, the most important part of the word culture is the first four letters, the rest is a suffix. Now, the English word culture, which obviously different languages have different words for this word, comes from the word cultivate. So, in other words, it's deliberately altering someone's living or the way they behave in order to get them to be cultured to behave a specific way. That's fine. But the word culture, used generally by some other people, philosophers and the like, the word culture cannot fully be explored because, of course, everything you do is culture. Everything you do, everything in your culture that you do is culture. You cannot break it down and say this is my culture, this is not my culture. Thing Trading with foreigners is part of your culture. Adopting things from foreigners is part of your culture. So that's what makes the question somewhat impossible to answer. But it's answerable. If you really want to know who the Arabians are in a strict way, it's the people located in here in the Arabian Peninsula.